My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. And I feel somewhat abashed. I say this with the word of apology. I'm a Gentile. I figured what these cars have been doing running up and down here, they've been smuggling Gentiles into this place. I figured when them Jews found out there was no dues or fees, they'd swamp us. I think we better clear the air a little bit here and be reminded of our primary purpose. And I think I could do it no better than tell it a psychiatrist who was visiting the mental institution. He was walking around in the yard of this parlor for the peculiars, and he came upon one of the inmates laying a row of bricks. And he stood there and he became amazed at the dexterity with which this nut was laying the brick. It was a thing of symmetrical beauty. And he said to the inmate, "My good man, what are you doing in an institution like this?" He said, "The way you perform those duties, you'd certainly be an asset to society. Are you crazy?" And he said, "Well, of course not. My family resents me, and they had me committed to this institution." And the psychiatrist said, "You'd be very valuable outside." He said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. On coming next Thursday, I'm going to sit on the board, and I will intercede in your behalf. We'll see if we can't get you out of this place and get you back into society where you belong." And he turned to leave, and he had walked about 10 steps, and the nut picked up a brick and hit him right in the back of the neck with it. And he went to his knees, and he finally struggled back to his feet, and he said to the nut, "What'd you do that for?" And the fellow said, "I just didn't want you to forget Thursday." Now that we have all of the spiritual part taken care of, we'll get into our business. Seriously, I'd love to say that I suppose that since Friday evening at this conference, that whether you realize it or not, that you folks have been privileged to enjoy more reckless laughter, more laughter with abandon, than some people get to enjoy in an entire lifetime. Do you realize that? That we come into this society in all shapes and forms and find the answer to our problem in a little laughter. And I don't ever want to cry again if I can help it. I think that I'd go back to one of our earlier days in AA and tell a little story about a gal that lit one of the first candles to our society, and some of the older dingies here will remember this, but you new folks who are coming into our society now will never get to meet the people that we met unless we tell you about them. This is a story that about a little Catholic sister named Ignatia, who upon the beginning of our society fell in love with Bob, and she decided to give the rest of her life to the work with alcoholics. And I suppose during the course of her life she treated 5,000 of us, and she became very aware of the nature of our malady. And treated, I suppose, no telling how many thousand. But she was a crusty little girl, and she, in her experience with alcoholics, had learned to talk the language of the alcoholic. And as the story goes, one night there was a drunk that they'd brought in, and he was going through the, what is that high-sounding word they use now, detoxifying procedure. In my day, we puked. But he was real sick, the drunk was, and in his self-pity he cried out to Sister Ignatia. And he said, "Sister, would you pray for me?" And she said, "Hell no, pray for yourself, because God loves to hear strange voices." So I can't tell you, but this whole thing from Friday evening until now has been the petition of many strange voices, crying out for the only source of relief that we have for our disease. I can't explain a great deal about God to you. It's a spiritual meeting. The only thing I could say really was that the God I understand is so powerful, is so unlimited in his powers that he can pick up 5,100 desperate, sick people and set them in an auditorium in Bakersfield, California on Sunday morning. This is the kind of a God I understand. And I'm not going to become maudlin. I think that if I have anything to say at all, I'd love to talk about how an alcoholic feels. This is for the guys that held their hands up a while ago. Because I came to AA, I wasn't the least bit interested in any of the goodies that the old dingy said when I came into AA. I was interested in the way I felt. I came into Alcoholics Anonymous as a result of the way I felt. And there's a line in our book of experience that reads per se, God would like for us to have our head in the clouds with him, but keep your feet on the ground because that's where your fellow travelers are. And I suspect that there are more of us here this morning because somebody used their feet instead of their head. I don't know how to describe an alcoholic. I can tell you what one is not. I was on a plane recently going out to Las Vegas to hold services. And there was a fellow who got on the plane, sat next to me, an impeccably dressed gentleman, and he made a complete ass of himself. He did this. Let me tell you what he did. When the stewardess started hustling the booze, he ordered a big double, you know, like they serve you. And she brought it to him, and he did one of the most disgusting things I've ever witnessed. He set that drink on his tray and began to read. And he like to have driven me out of my mind. I wanted to say, God damn it, drink it, fella, drink it. Just drink it. And do you know that when the stewardess brought the meal, she picked up part of that drink and took it back? Now the difference is this. The stewardess said to me, Mr. Leaf, would you like to have a drink? And I said, no, ma'am, I have to be home in February. She said, I don't understand. I said, no, you never will. Really. And I think we sometimes swim around in a puddle of profundity and intellectuality trying to describe the most beautiful thing that's sitting in front of us all the time. And one of the common complaints that we hear in alcohol, Anonymous. People they spend 15 years trying to find out why they drank. I don't care why I drank. We have a book in our line in our book of experience that tells you very simply. In fact, most of the answers to most of your problems are in this book here that says on the front cover of it. It's a basic text for Alcoholics Anonymous. I believe it's going to catch on one of these days, too. But it says in there that David quoted it last night, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. Then them goddamn psychiatrists had me convinced that I drank because my mama put me on the pot backwards, you see. Men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcoholism. Sensation is so elusive, it says in the next sentence, that even though they admit that it is injurious, after a time, this is kind of like it says in the Scripture, and it came to pass, after a time they cannot differentiate truth and false. And then the third sentence in there puts the britches on you. It says, he thinks. So God, that's dangerous for any of us, you know. Said the alcoholic thinks that his life is the only normal one. You see? When you're talking to a drunk and go read a pamphlet to him over the side of the bed, you better be quicker to puke on that. Because you're talking to a man that thinks he's leading the most normal life. Here, I thought it was normal to throw up every morning. I used to rent a hotel room with twin beds in it, one to sleep in, one to puke in. He thinks that his alcoholic life is the only normal one. Can't you hear me, huh? You're probably a hell of a lot better off. These things are like an old barroom spittoon. If you don't get the proper aim on them, you can make a hell of a mess, you know. What part do you want me to go over? So we found out why we drank. And they want to know if you're an alcoholic. People, they're very doubtful about it. You have to dig some of them out of their woodwork every now and then, and these are the people that we call the alcoholic revisited. And the book tells you, he just read it a while ago, said, no, he didn't either. It's in chapter 4, that if you find yourself drinking and cannot quit, or if you find yourself drinking and have no control over the amount that you drink, You are probably, it says, don't even nail you down there. The book's gentle with you. Said you're probably an alcoholic. See, the book Alcoholics Anonymous, as I describe it, is a series of propositions and promises whose ultimate fulfillment hang upon the reader and his subsequent action. This is what the big book's like. I knew the author of the big book, and the reason that I know it is a spiritual treatise is because the man that wrote it wasn't capable of it. There was another hand over his shoulder. And I well believe that it is one of the most fabulous pieces of writing in its continuity and text that's ever been devised to rehabilitate a major part of our alcoholic problem. Then our author came out of the hospital, town's hospital, with a thing that some of us talked about. I've heard it mentioned once at this convention, but it's one of my pets. He came out with a description for us, a very tender description, and he brought it into our book in 2 or 3 places, Bill did. And he called it a thing, an obsession. You ever thought about it? An obsession. Said that is what we had. It's a nice, gentle word. He could have well said that we had a compulsive trait, or that we were addicted, or that we had an alcoholic syndrome, whatever the hell that is. I used to think that a syndrome was a cat house where they competed. Said that we had an obsession. I like it because it's a cover-up for everything that I did as an alcoholic. And society condemned me for what the obsession made me do, never for the obsession. And psychiatry wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They won't talk about obsessions. And the definition of an obsession in the dictionary reads like this, per se: to be possessed of an idea to the exclusion of all other ideas. How about that? The first thing in your life. To be owned by an idea to the exclusion of all other ideas. And society condemned us for what the obsession made us do, not for the obsession instead. I don't know, maybe we can talk about an obsession. If you got an obsession to do something, you're going to do it. You know, if you're going to dance, if he wants to dance a jig, he's going to get out there and do it while I'm talking and making a difference. An obsession is that way. You have no control over an obsession. You're possessed of an idea to the exclusion of all other ideas. Maybe I can tell it a better way where you can understand. When I was a kid, we had an old dog. And my father named him Millard Fillmore. If he'd had 2 more left feet, they could have named him McGovern, but they didn't do it. Now that we've cleared that to me, I'll get even with you saying I look like Lyndon Johnson. Of all the nice Republicans I could look like, I got to be born looking like that bastard. You think I ain't got resentment? He wanted to hire me for a stand-in, but I couldn't get a thick enough bulletproof vest. But this old dog that we had when I was a kid, he was a dog. Sort of a square-cut, contemplative-looking dog there. And my father loved him very dearly, but Millard had the worst case of fleas I have ever seen in my life. And he scratched all the time, just scratch, 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 and look up at you with those big brown eyes and scratch. See, he was uncomfortable, and he was relieving his discomfort by scratching. When we got uncomfortable, we drank. And we condemned him for what his obsession made him do. We used to cuss him, Did you ever hear a dog thump at night on the floor, And I damn that dog. He kept me awake all night long, he said. So we tired of this, and my father bought some of the most hellishly bad-smelling soap that I've ever smelt, and after a couple of rounds of close infighting, we got Millard in a tub, and we defleed him. And we washed him and soaped him and got every flea off of Millard. And do you know that he still wanted to scratch? You see, the necessity to relieve his discomfort had become an obsession. How about that? And he'd look up at me with tears in his eyes, wanting to scratch, and I wouldn't let him, you see. And he got real furtive about it, and he'd run off and sneak a scratch. And we condemned him for what his obsession caused him to do. The alcoholic is the same in our society. Until the advent of our society, when somebody stopped and tried to understand one of us, somebody took the time to maybe find out why we scratch. And for this, I'm so grateful. I'm grateful to have come along at a time like this, to be here today at a time like this, in the advent of the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous. I think this is the most prideful thing that you can be. Used to be, when I came there, we were worried about the stigma on alcoholism. God forbid. We used to stand in front of the club and talk to one another in a dead conversation until we thought nobody was looking, and then duck upstairs. Didn't want nobody to see us. And now the biggest problem in AA is keeping out the social climbers. I belong to the only AA club, I guess, anywhere. We got a drunk in our club that's a billionaire, I guess. David knows him real well. He's got enough money to burn a wet mule with. And he won't park his Rolls Royce down on the lot. He parks it right out in the street where everybody in this little town knows that Raymond's at an AA meeting. He's not the least bit worried about the stigma on alcoholism, and this is one of the things I'm so thankful for. One of the things I like to talk about is the relief of shame and humiliation when you come to AA. This is a promise that's in our book. It's a promise that's in our book. We say that we share our experience, strength, and hope with one another. There's a hell of a lot of difference between sharing your experience and imposing your opinion on somebody. I just thought I'd throw that in for the record, my God. Sharing your experience, strength and hope. I think this is the most prideful thing, and the shame. I couldn't talk very long on humility because I'm not humble. I won this tie in a humility contest down in my club down there. It is. I got to say this, really. Isn't it disgusting the way these men dress? Where's that fellow with those checkered pants on this morning? It's the chairman of your convention. It's singularly undignified. And the way these fellas wear these loud coats and ties and that, it works a hell of a hardship on the women because you can't tell who the pimps are anymore. We wear stuff now I used to get arrested for. Well, seriously, I'll tell you a little about my drinking if I got time. Oh, that's not near time for me to get well yet. This thing gets to be rather competitive, you know, as the speakers get up and talk one from the other, and they tell these pathetic stories about the sad things that befell them when they drank, you know, and the next one gets up and tells it more. Hell, David nearly had us back to the womb with that drinking last night at the early age of 8 days. And it does. It sometimes become rather competitive about the bad things that happen to you. Hell, I can win the contest right here. Years ago, when we moved from Los Angeles to Sacramento, I got run over by the welcome wagon. You can't find it no worse than that. But I drank early, like the book said, because I liked the effect of alcohol, and found it and used it. Used it at every turn. I know the fellas that I drank with that night. Some of them are still in my hometown, and some of them still remain in the realm of, what is that nebulous place we talk about social drinking. I have a very humble opinion about social drinking, and that is if you take the most pious and unctuous old sister out of the church and slap about 8 slugs of that gallow in her, she's going to become unsocial as hell. This is an irrevocable rule. Well, I sure do. Where's the gal that talked about drinking the wine, the gallow? Oh, God, I could talk with her, I'll tell you. And I used it for a long time. And all the things happened to me, and some more, I think, that happened to everybody else. And I began to acquire all of the little idiosyncrasies, that's a hell of a word for you, of the alcoholic. All the exercise I ever used to take was when I shook and trembled. And I used to throw up all the time. Nothing new about that. I could stand here and give you a dissertation on puking and run the gamut from projectile puking to spray puking. There's a lot of it. There's a fine art in that. Take an hour to tell you all about that. This is no use. I'm really sailing under an assumed name. I'm really from California. But it sounds better to come from Texas, you know. I went to hell out here. And I left here a thoroughly discredited man. Don't that sound good? They ran me out. I used to love to say that when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was wanted in 2 states and not wanted in 46 others. This is a hell of a disease, you know, and the treatment for alcoholism back until the advent of our society, it had one treatment for alcoholics, and that's keep him moving. No family likes to admit they've got one of us, and my family had one. You know, you're not going to go in and play bridge and they say, what's that noise out in the back? Oh, it's my son. He's an alcoholic, you know. And I started out in Southern California, down here in Hollywood, with some of my friends, and for a country East Texas boy, I got into one of the weirdest professions that a man can imagine. I was designing ladies' lingerie. And if you think this ain't a trick for a farm boy, you ought to get with it. This is where you cut these soft, silk, sleazy, intimate things that the ladies wear. If any of you girls got a pinch, I ain't been down there in a long time. You can't blame it on me. And we've got a step in Alcoholics Anonymous, the second one, right here, where it infers that you might have a gopher in the garden. Let me tell you something. If you cut a bunch of braziers with 3 of them places in them, you're nuts. And I told a psychiatrist about that once, and he said it was just wishful thinking. Needless to say, I cut myself out of that profession. This is the loss of the first job. You know, people come into AA, and I was very impressed with them not talking about drinking. They kept talking about all the little things that caused it. And I think that the alcoholic, safe trip, Ramona. To talk about courage in Alcoholics Anonymous. I think when an alcoholic loses his first job, this is the beginning of the perpetual lie that we go from one to another until the thing's over. You know, a drunk never could get his second job if he told about the first one, could he? And I was completely thrown out of the garment industry. It's easy to get a bad reputation in a small town. But when the sound the size of Los Angeles, when they've heard of you, before you get there, you've had it. And I remember this. I've always resented the Jewish people for this. I worked for a Jew down in the garment area down there, and he was a kind, compassionate man. And he couldn't understand why we do like we do. And he told me, he said, Joe, I've got lots invested in your education, but you can't drink. You can't drink. And I remember how offended I was at this and how it hurt me so deep. And this was the beginning of a lot of hurts and humiliations that followed me until the day I got to AA. And then in an aside, this Jewish fellow said to me, he said, well, you know, everything's got some good to it. Said, I've got one thing to be thankful for, and that is that the way you handle those scissors, if you would have been a rabbi, you would have destroyed our whole race. You got to let that roll around for a little while. So I went down to San Pedro. Here's my girlfriend from San Pedro. This was during the war. And I bought a plumber's license out the back door of a union hall. And I went into the shipyard as a master plumber. This is a fellow that had never picked up anything any heavier than a pair of scissors. And I went in as a master plumber. You know, I was a master fraud. And those were the days, if you remember this, and it's a revolting idea, when you were frozen to your job. Do you remember that? I thawed out. I have a little pink document that hangs in my den at home today, and it's signed by the United States War Department of Labor, and it prohibits me from working within 25 miles of the city of Los Angeles. Job number 2. And I wondered, here we go, we make the move. We move from Los Angeles to Sacramento. And the things that I could do were becoming less and less. Our choices seem to be less as we go along in the progression of alcoholism. And I went to Northern California, and I'll quickly run through this. I think that I went to work for the railroad up in Sacramento. And I'd love to say here that they're the most narrow-minded group of people that I've ever come in contact with. They have a rule about drinking, you know. And they say that if you're seen coming out of an establishment that dispenses alcoholic beverages, you can be fired. Well, I never came out very often, but when I did then, it was under duress and coercion. And I guess they felt that, you know, if a man was a little addled, that he might mess him up, you know. And one of the common complaints that we hear in Alcoholics Anonymous is a drunk comes in and he starts talking about his inability to hide the jug from his Al-Anon. And while I'm on that subject, I'd love to say that if some of the men get up here and say, I wonder how I live long enough to get to AA, I wonder how some of these Al-Anons live long enough. But I got called one night. Maybe you'll understand this vernacular, this parlance of the railroad, but I got called off of the extra board to go on a little train up to Marysville. I hope there's somebody here from Marysville. It's goddamn mosquitoes up there. But I went up there this night on this train crew to do a little work, and they had called a crew just like me. I had to help the engineer up on the engine to get out of the yard, you know. It's a good thing you don't have to guide a train. If you did, you'd have more catastrophe than you presently do. But we got up there and we did some work by brute force and awkwardness, and I fell over a few switches, but we got along, you know. And at 10 o'clock, to my utter delight, I found a big shed that had a track in it. I believe it was an almond shed or something of that nature. And I took this train and chopped it up into little pieces all over Marysville, a car here and a car there and a few here, so that it would have no resemblance of being a train. And I took the engine and the caboose and put them in this shed and locked the door. And we went to the bar. And the war was going on, and the dispatcher was real perturbed. And he called and he couldn't find us, and we hadn't reported in a long time. You can imagine his concern. And we were in the bar. And finally, after calling all up and down the line from, I think, Roseville to Red Bluff, he sent an official in an automobile all the way from Sacramento up to Marysville to look for us. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, he came in this combination bar and pool room and found us. And these were the words that he said. What did you do with it? Then you couldn't hide a jug from that broad you were living with, you know. Seemed to ferret it out. You see, he thinks, it says in the book, that he's leading an entirely normal life. That this life is an entirely normal one. He cannot differentiate the true from the false. I love to tell a little story, and Lou Ann has insisted that I tell it, about a drunk being able to orient himself to any surroundings. You know, we could do that. We could stay in a room for 10 days and it'd look good. But he's really oblivious to things that go on around him. And he can orient himself to the conditions at hand. This is a story about some of my wife's cats. Mary and I have always had cats. We just love them, and we've had some good cats and bad cats. And expensive cats, we have 5 now. Have 2 inside cats and 3 outside cats. And when you try to pick up the inside cats to carry them outside, the outside ones sneak in the door and become inside cats. But years ago, I was working in a little town called Goose Creek, Texas, and selling insurance. Or people were taking it away from me, really. And Icky Sheridan, one of our trustees, bless his heart, there's some people here that knew Icky, and he used to say that if you can smell yourself, other people have been smelling you 3 days. I'll always remember that was one of the first things Icky told me, and we sobered up about the same time. He was a great man in AA. But back to the story, I was in Goose Creek, and my wife went off up into Illinois to help her sister have a baby. And while she was gone, I got fired. And the procedure in those days, I don't know whether you fellows ever did this or not, every time you got fired, you went home to Mama to get a new start, you know. It's just natural, and I always went home to Mama and barged out from there into various other activities. So I had to go home, and it was 300 miles, and I remember this night, and I loaded the mattress and a few little trinkets in the back of an old 31 Chevrolet automobile, and I put the 2 big tomcats on top of the mattress and set out for Tyler, which is some 300 miles. And if I remember, it was a cool, pleasant evening. And as I arrived at the outskirts of Houston, I saw a sign that read, 3 pints for the price of 2. And not ever being one to pass up a bargain, I bought the 3 pints for the price of 2. And I started driving north. And I remember what a great feeling of well-being that I had that night. As I drove along, the windows were frosted up, and it was cool, and I was belting this jug and talking to myself and singing a little, "Oh, promise me," and you know, you never have done that, have you? And I got up to a little town called Cleveland, Texas, to get out and get a chaser for one of these jugs. And when I came back to the car, by this time I was a little addled, one of these damn tomcats got out. And I knew I dare not go home without him, so I chased him in the rain and in this red mud all over this little town, and finally caught him up under a cotton gin, pulled him out by his hind leg, and I whipped him all the way back to the car. And I threw him in the back of that hot automobile, and he did a thing on that mattress that wasn't nice. It was a sort of a Picasso study in brown. Do you think it bothered me? I crawled right in, took another honk on the jug, and drove along completely oblivious to my surroundings, and it hurts me to even think of it now. Still singing, still talking to myself, still belting, "Oh, promise me," you know. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, I threw up in the front seat. And I drove into a little town as it was breaking day, a little town called Aldo, Texas. It had 2 street lights, dim street lights, and I drove over to the side and pulled up to take a honk on the jug to start the day off right. And there was a town clown there, a constable or a deputy sheriff or something. He was a door rattler, and it was possibly the first chance that he'd had to make an arrest in a long time. And he came racing up to the... And he came racing up to the window of this car and rapped on it and said, "Let that window down." And he said, "What do you think you're... Oh, my God." And he slowly walked away. And I would say to you, that when you put your arm around a sick old drunk, he don't know how he feels. He cannot differentiate the true from the false. And I would say to you that with all of the intellectuality, all of the progress, and all of the agencies that we have assisting us, that there is nothing in the recovery of an alcoholic that will substitute for an hour of your time. This is what it's all about. What did the book say? Keep your feet on the ground, because that's where your fellow travelers are. I'd like to talk about something else in AA. Maybe for the gals in AA, about this thing that we talk about coming in AA, and the humiliations and the indignities that we subject ourselves to as a result of this obsession that is possessing us to the exclusion of all other ideas. And that's a shame that we come to AA. I'd like to make you a promise that when you come in that door, it's all over. It wasn't thus when I came. And I think our facility has grown to the point to recognize this as an illness and treat it as it should be. And there's a line in our book of experience, it's one of the greatest promises that one could have. Falls into the chapter that has the word spiritual in it 18 times, if you want something spiritual. Runs the gamut of spiritual infancy to spiritual maturity. And the line reads like this: cling to the thought that in God's hands your dark past is the greatest treasure you possess. Hey, this puts you in business with him, don't it? Cling to the thought that in God's hands your dark past is the greatest treasure you possess. And I thought when I came there I was going to have to get rid of it. This is our story. This is our experience. This is the only thing that separates you and me from the man out on the street. That's all. Your dark past. Cling to the thought that in God's hand And then it puts you in such a deeply embroiled business with God, where it says you can avert death for other alcoholics. What other facet of society has been given the unlimited power like this? For your dark past, to avert death and misery for others. And then people get up and say, I don't want to talk about my drinking. The hell else have you got to talk about? Now, not 4 years and 6 months ago, I had a heart attack. And it was a bad one. I had 2 complete cardiac arrests. And would you believe that the most prominent heart specialist in that area was standing in for my doctor that night? Would you believe that? And the recovery was very slow and tedious, and I learned to live another new way of life. And at this point, I'm very thankful for the heart attack because it made a better person of me, I hope. And about 2 months ago, I got fretful and I went to see this little doctor, and I said, I wish you'd give me a complete going over and examine me. I just need to know how I am. You know, it gets old walking around, getting ready to drop dead every minute, I tell you. It does, and I wanted some assurance out of this little fella. And he's the sweetest guy on earth. And he gave me the whole works. Examined me very thoroughly, and he got through, he started talking. And he said, you didn't have to tell us that you had had a heart attack if you'd have just come in off of the street. This machine that we hooked you to would show this scar every time. And then he added the sweetest words that I've ever heard that brought me face to face with the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, would you believe that the scar is the strongest part of your heart? And I thought, my God, where have I been? In AA. And I think that the people who come into AA all as a result of alcoholism, all scarred up. We all do. And we bring them with us and we try to hide them. And then I had to think of that line. Cling to the thought that in God's hands your scars are the greatest treasure you possess. No, I think that Alcoholics Anonymous has progressed to the point where there's no shame involved anymore. I'll say this very cold-bloodedly and without any fear of contradiction. I live in a small town of less than 75,000 people, and I've been a member of Alcoholics Anonymous for 22 years and 6 months. Most everybody in Tyler knows that Joe's in Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't tell them unless they ask. But the fact that I'm an alcoholic, the fact that I'm an Alcoholics Anonymous in my little town has never shut a door in my face. And for this I'm grateful. For this I owe to you. For assuming a responsibility in AA. And I think, my God, the first responsibility that we have in this society is what we show the man the first night he comes. This is the greatest responsibility. I'll jump the story. They ran me out of California. I ended up in jail in my own hometown. My mother had me locked up there. And a fellow came to my jail cell one Monday morning and told me about Alcoholics Anonymous. And it seems to me that in all of my lifetime, up until this time, I had never heard what people say.
And he came, people say, what is the message of Alcoholics Anonymous? We're going to carry the message. Hell, you're the message. I'd just soon take a deaf mute with me and let him sit on the foot of the bed and let the drunk look at him. Because here was a fellow standing in front of my jail cell who used 5 magic words. I know how you feel. This is the first time in my existence that anybody had ever said that. It seemed to me that the whole society had looked down at me like this. And this was the first time anybody ever came and shared of themselves, and there was some communication that must have existed there subconsciously, because I could feel that he meant it. People talk about God. I can see it in his eyes. You don't describe things like that. I can see it here this morning. I can see it in all the convention. This is the indescribable facet of our society. And he stood there and talked to me as calmly and as peacefully, and in fact, he irritated me because I couldn't rattle him. I couldn't make him react. And everybody that had ever talked to me up until this time, I tried to cut at him and make him react, and he wouldn't move. He stood still and gave me the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't follow him. No, hell, I was too full of resentments. My people had to hire 2 deputy sheriffs, and they loaded me in a police car and carried me to Houston. This is the treatment for the alcoholic. Keep him moving, you know. And I had to go another 5 months, and they loaded me off of the train in Los Angeles in a wheelchair. Some smart ass said that we use this car, it goes both ways, and you can't live in it. And I'd set up shop in one of the toilets. And they took me in 3 dirty old bags and dumped me very unceremoniously out in front of the station in L.A., the old railroad station. And I can say with all the fun that we have and all the levity, all the jocularity, that we look back on the story of a ridiculous alcoholic, that I went through the next 5 months of living hell. I ended up under the bridge in Sacramento, sleeping intermittently between there and a flop house a block from the jail. What is that, I Street, I guess? And I had a pamphlet that this guy had given me in this jail, the front of which read, there wasn't any literature like there is in these days, but some guy had written this down in the South, and the front of this piece of paper said, "Slaves of drink find peace of mind." I never had the courage to read it. These bags, it seemed to me, in my maudlin state at night, every time I opened up one of these damn bags, that pamphlet was on top. It seemed to me. I never read it, but I read the cover. And I got up and staggered out of that place with brute force and awkwardness and went to look for the fellow that had given me that pamphlet. You know, there's a dramatic air about the action of any alcoholic. I staggered some 2,600 miles to find that fellow. And after I got sober, I found out that there was an AA club 3 blocks from where I damn near died. And I came to my first AA meeting when I got there. Well, I don't know, back in those days, why were they all upstairs? And they shoved me up the stairs of this old AA club, and I remember it down in Tyler, and the stairs were kind of cut on the bias. It was dark, you know, AA was still in the shadows. And I'll never forget, I've had to compare every other AA meeting with that one. Because it seems to me that those people at this AA meeting, with this God look in their eyes, seemed to stop everything that they were doing and immediately become concerned with me. Immediately. Come in, sit down, and have a cup of coffee. God damn, I ate so many sugar donuts and drank so much coffee, and it was just like taking castor oil. I could taste the inside of my pocket and tell you the last AA meeting I'd been to. I didn't have a handkerchief, and I wiped my hands inside my pocket. And I came to AA. and got well. And that night in this group, there stood two people that lived up to their responsibility in Alcoholics Anonymous. One of them was the old sheriff who had locked me up in his jail some 12 years prior to that time for felonious drunk driving. And here he stood in AA this night with his pistols on, and he came up and put his arm around me and I suppose gave me the essence of our society. He said, "I love you, boy, and you can stay sober just like I did." What is this gift of love that we experience in this society? What is the transmittal of such a thing but the true effect of God? And there was another fellow sitting there that night who just drove me crazy. He was sitting over to the left of me, and he was gently puffing on a cigar, and he had this serenity thing that we get in AA. And he had a big diamond ring on, and he just sat there and he drove me mad. I hadn't been there in 20 years, and I knew him. And after the meeting, I discovered that I had soldiered with him some 20 years prior to this time. And the last time I had seen him, he was a blubbering idiot in an army camp. And they had him chained to a post, and he'd run up and down a post like a monkey. And here he sat in AA. And do you know what my first reaction was? If it'll help him that much, it'll make a goddamn genius out of me. And then I got it all. I quit cussing and just became secure. I didn't know, I didn't do anything anymore, and I became what you might well describe as godlike. You ever seen any AA members who were godlike? And I had a call to go see a drunk one night that had his jug, and we took his jug back from the bartender, and I put him in the car and was driving along with him. And he didn't want to get sober, but I couldn't see that. I was too godlike, And as we drove slowly, I began to give him the pitch. And Jesus, I felt good, and I talked with eloquence. And the guy's eyes began to water, and I thought, I'm getting him. And as we drove on slowly, I talked with more eloquence, and he gently lay his head over on my shoulder. And I knew I had it. Did you ever hear of a drunk puking silently? Every time I've ever gotten godlike with a drunk, he puked on me. And I'll tell you one more experience and we'll go home. I don't know how long you work with a drunk. Really, I don't. I worked with one down in my hometown for 4.5 years. He was a scurvy character, and my wife got a call one morning to come see him. And she said, yes, Joe will come, and I found him, and he was verging on DT. And I borrowed a goblet full of whiskey and poured it down him and knocked him out, really. And when he kind of came unshuffled from this drink, he was in an AA club. I believe any way you get him there is good. And he got sober, this guy, under my direction. And he stayed sober for 3 months, and he got drunk. Didn't hurt him much, but it raised hell with my ego. And I was determined that he was going to get sober. And I went back again and again and again in this procedure. And he had a little affectation that I know none of you have ever had. He would go to faraway places and call me collect, just to tell me that he was drunk. And I prayed about him. I prayed about him diligently. I said, God, you've been watching the sparrows too much to let me have this one, And he became a sort of a side project with me. But I kept it going. And about 12 years ago, he got on for him what I hope was his last drunk in one of our local motels. and he called another fella from our club. And he went out and talked to that bastard 10 minutes, and he's been sober ever since. And I hated his guts. And I'd sit in the club room and look at him and think, you ought to be mine. If I know anything of the treasure, then God gives us an Alcoholics Anonymous. I owe him more than he owes me. He kept me sober for 4.5 years. I don't know how to stop this thing. God Almighty, I feel so much of you that it's a feeling that's beyond description. Maybe if we stop with a little story that came out of another book, we could leave this one for a few minutes. There's not much difference in the story from the other book and one of these. This is a story that came out of the Scripture. This is Sunday morning. I think it's rather befitting. And it's a story in the Scripture of the fellow that they call the demoniac. And I'm going to have to tell it like I read it. And this is a story about a demoniac. In those days, they called this fellow demoniac. He was a maniac full of demons, they said. And, of course, they didn't have psychiatry in those days. If you'd have got him now, he'd have been a catatonic or a bedwetter or something, you know. But for the lack of better verbiage, this fellow was a demoniac. In the Scripture, you can go read it. And it says that he was so wild that no man could tame him. He was so wild. And that the manifestations of his disease, can you imagine that in the Scripture? The manifestations of his disease were such that they had to keep him in fetters and chains. Hell, that's kind of like me. And then it said in there that he got so bad that they had to run him out of town. That's kind of like me. And he ended up out on the riverbank eating with pigs. Kind of like me. And if you have the imagination that I have, you can see the picture vividly. I can see it. The dirty beard, the growth, the habiliment that he had on, the vain babble. Pure nut. A pure nut. And there seems to have been at that time a little carpenter fellow who was going around teaching some new philosophy of love. The little carpenter fellow had a facility that you and I in Alcoholics Anonymous have not quite acquired. He could see no ill in anyone. And he said to the nut, the demoniac on Billy Pigs, he said, what's the matter, friend? Are you having some trouble? And the poor guy in his self-pity said, trouble is my name. They call me Legion, which means many. And I can see him in his self-pity because I've felt it so many times. The little carpenter didn't hesitate a minute. He made his call quickly. And he knew that the man needed some help, and he effected a healing process that was as little understood in those days as the process of Alcoholics Anonymous is today. And it had to do with casting some evil spirits out of this demoniac into some pigs, if you know the story, and they ran off down the hill into the water and were dead. And there were some stool pigeons around, like there always is. And they saw what had happened to the pigs, and they went into town and told the people. You know, in those days, David, the pig business was big business. And they went into town and told these people, said, you're out of the pig business. And they were upset like anybody would be at the loss of their big business, which was pig business. And the Bible says that they went out in mass. And here are the beautiful lines that come from Alcoholics Anonymous. It said that when they got there he sat, fully clothed and in his right mind. We've got a step in Alcoholics Anonymous that says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. There he sat, fully clothed and in his right mind. And the people were more interested in the loss of these material things than they were in one feller getting well. And they prevailed upon them to leave. Believe you me, in Alcoholics Anonymous, we better damn well be sure that we're more interested in one feller getting well. And I can see the fella, as timid as he was, and relying upon his sponsors, so to speak. And he had just come from one hellish existence and had not experienced the joy of another. And in his self-pity, he said to the little carpenter, let me go with you, will you? And the little carpenter broke a rule for us. Everybody that he'd ever helped up until this time, he'd said, go away now and don't say anything about it. It's all right, it's all over. And he never told them what he told the nut. And this is the answer that he gave him, and I would hand it to you as members of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, no, you can't go with me. Stay here so that others can see what has happened to you. Thank you very much.